From the moment American forces first set foot on the blood-soaked islands of the Pacific, one question lingered in the minds of Japanese commanders and echoed through the diaries of soldiers who survived the early clashes. Who were these Marines who fought with such relentless determination? As the Pacific War spiraled into one of the most brutal campaigns in modern history, Japanese troops, raised in a culture that celebrated death before surrender and trained to believe themselves the fiercest warriors in Asia, found themselves stunned by an adversary they had not expected, an enemy who not only refused to break under fire, but who seemed to grow fiercer the more the battle demanded of them. From the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic trenches of Iwo Jima, Marines advanced with a mixture of discipline, firepower, and sheer resolve that forced even hardened Japanese veterans to rethink everything they believed about American capability and willpower. This documentary begins with the mystery that crept into Japanese operational reports and post-war interviews alike. Why did the men of the Imperial Army, who were taught that Americans were soft, undisciplined, and unprepared for close combat, come to admit, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes with awe, that fighting United States Marines was unlike facing any other opponent in World War II? How the Pacific War began to change Japanese perceptions. In the early months of World War II, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with astonishing speed, convinced that their warrior ethos, night-fighting mastery, and years of brutal training gave them an unassailable edge over any Western opponent, especially Americans, whom their propaganda described as indulgent, impatient, and unwilling to endure hardship. But as 1942 unfolded, cracks began to form in that overconfidence. Reports from frontline units moving through New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the Central Pacific began to reveal a pattern. American resistance was stiffer than anticipated, and in places where the United States Marine Corps took the field, the fighting grew unexpectedly fierce. Japanese intelligence officers who studied early engagements noted that Marines recovered more rapidly from surprise attacks than expected, held positions under heavy bombardment longer than predicted, and displayed an unsettling ability to adapt to jungle terrain, despite having no historical experience in such environments. Even before the first major Marine-Japanese battle, commanders such as Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake quietly warned Tokyo that the Americans were not fighting in the manner Japanese doctrine had anticipated. The stage was being set for a massive collision that would overturn assumptions on both sides, but for the Japanese in particular, these early signs hinted at a truth they were reluctant to face. The Pacific War would not be the easy triumph their leaders had promised, and the United States Marines were beginning to emerge as a uniquely formidable enemy. The shock of Guadalcanal, meeting the Marines for the first time. When Japanese forces first clashed directly with US Marines on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the encounter shattered every expectation they had carried into the campaign. Japanese soldiers, many of them veterans of China and Southeast Asia, initially believed they were facing poorly trained colonial troops who would crumble under a determined assault. Instead, they found themselves fighting opponents who dug in deep, held their fire with discipline, and counterattacked with a ferocity that stunned even elite units like Ichiki's battalion. The catastrophic destruction of Ichiki's force at the Battle of the Tenaru became a grim milestone. Here, Japanese troops saw Marines calmly set interlocking fields of fire, maneuver machine gun teams under pressure, and launch bayonet charges that caught stunned attackers off guard. Diaries recovered from the battlefield described Marines as unyielding, cold in battle, and impossible to dislodge once entrenched. What struck many Japanese survivors most was that the Marines did not retreat when outnumbered or outflanked. They regrouped, reorganized, and counterpunched with deadly coordination. Night after night, Japanese infantry attempted their famed banzai attacks, expecting to exploit American fear of darkness, only to discover that Marines were not only prepared for night fighting, but often fought back even harder. From these early clashes on Guadalcanal, a new and unsettling recognition began to form within Japanese ranks. The United States Marines were not the fragile, inexperienced enemy they had imagined, but a dangerous force whose tenacity posed a threat unlike any they had encountered before. Learning the hard way. What Japanese officers reported about Marine training and discipline. As the brutal campaign on Guadalcanal unfolded, Japanese officers began compiling detailed intelligence assessments that painted a far more serious picture of the Marines than pre-war doctrine had ever acknowledged, and these reports circulated quietly through commands in Rabaul, Truk and Tokyo, with a tone of growing concern. Captured equipment revealed that Marines were drilled in fire and maneuver tactics uncommon among most Allied infantry at the time, enabling small units to operate independently with surprising flexibility. Japanese observers noted the Marines' ability to maintain cohesion even under starvation, disease, and relentless bombardment, conditions that had broken many armies in Asia. Field intelligence memos described how Marines consistently fought in coordinated teams, riflemen advancing under the steady protection of Browning automatic rifles, mortarmen quickly adjusting fire, and machine gun crews shifting positions with practiced precision. Officers such as Colonel Masanobu Tsuji wrote that Marines respond quickly to changing conditions and show skill in independent judgment, a trait the Japanese considered extremely dangerous in jungle warfare. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the Marines' resilience after suffering casualties. Unlike many armies that faltered when leaders were killed, Marine squads and platoons displayed a culture of initiative in which junior NCOs stepped forward immediately, keeping the fight moving without hesitation. By late 1942, Japanese analytical reports no longer dismissed the Marines as inexperienced Americans. They identified them as a tough, adaptive, and professionally trained force whose discipline was directly altering the course of the Pacific War, one hard-fought battle at a time. Tarawa, the battle that proved the Marines would not break. When the Japanese garrison on Betio Island prepared for the inevitable American assault in November 1943, they believed their fortress was impregnable, boasting concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and a commander who confidently declared that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. But the US Marines proved him wrong in just 76 hours, at a cost that shocked both sides into rethinking the nature of modern warfare. For the first time, Japanese defenders witnessed Marines advancing through withering machine gun bursts, artillery barrages, and sniper fire that should have halted any rational attacker. Yet the Marines pushed forward yard by yard, crawling over bodies, shattered landing craft, and burning debris to close with defenders who had been trained to fight to the last man. Surviving Japanese accounts expressed astonishment at the Marines' refusal to withdraw even when pinned down for hours on the open reef, exposed to enfilading fire. Instead, they reorganized under fire, called in naval gunfire with uncanny precision, and launched relentless assaults that slowly cracked each defensive pocket. The Japanese were equally shocked by the Marines' mastery of combined arms. Flamethrower teams working in tandem with Shermans, combat engineers blasting through seawalls, and rifle companies assaulting pillboxes with a calculated ferocity that defied earlier assumptions about American softness. When the smoke cleared and only 17 of nearly 4,800 Japanese defenders remained alive, the psychological impact reverberated across the Pacific. High Command realized that if Marines were willing to pay such a horrific price to seize a speck of land barely big enough to land aircraft, then every island ahead, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, would be a crucible fought against an enemy who simply did not know how to stop. Saipan and the collapse of old strategies. By the time Japanese forces faced the Marines on Saipan in June 1944, the lessons of Guadalcanal and Tarawa had already shaken their confidence, but nothing prepared them for the scale and efficiency of the marine assault that unfolded on this critical island in the Marianas, where the outcome would determine the fate of Japan's defensive perimeter. From the moment the Marines landed on the western beaches under the thunder of the largest naval bombardment yet seen in the Pacific, Japanese officers were stunned not only by the overwhelming firepower, but by how swiftly Marines transformed chaos into coordinated action. Intelligence logs from the 31st Army reveal growing alarm as Marine infantry advanced inland with a seamless integration of tanks, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support. An operational unity that Japanese commanders realized they could not counter with static positions or isolated counterattacks. Saipan also revealed something culturally disorienting. Marines displayed a level of adaptability in urban combat, cave clearing, and countering night infiltration that contradicted every Japanese assumption about American inflexibility. As the Japanese launched their massive gyokusai, or suicidal banzai attack, they expected to break the Marines through shock and sheer numbers, but instead they encountered disciplined lines of automatic fire, coordinated machine gun crossfires, and small unit leaders who held firm even when entire companies were overrun. The failure of this final charge convinced many survivors that the strategies that once succeeded in China and Southeast Asia were hopeless against an enemy who combined individual grit with industrial power. Saipan marked a turning point. Japanese forces no longer viewed the Marines as simply dangerous. They saw them as the spearhead of an unstoppable advance, reshaping defensive planning for every battle that followed, including the volcanic nightmare awaiting both sides on Iwo Jima. The rise of marine tactics, raiders, night fighting, and combined arms power. As the Pacific Campaign pressed westward, Japanese commanders began to realize that what made the Marines so formidable was not merely their courage, but the evolution of a fighting doctrine that fused small unit innovation with overwhelming support assets, turning each battlefield into a proving ground for new forms of combat. Reports captured on Saipan and Guam described Marine raider units, light, fast, and trained for infiltration, as particularly troubling because they mirrored many traits the Japanese had once considered uniquely their own: stealthy night movement, sudden ambushes, and aggressive reconnaissance that mapped out Japanese positions long before the main force landed. Japanese troops who once relied on darkness to gain advantage found themselves countered by Marines who had studied and practiced night defense to an exacting science, placing overlapping listening posts, disciplined fire control, and quick reaction squads that blunted infiltration attempts that previously shattered Allied lines. Even more alarming was the Marines' mastery of combined arms, which Japanese observers called the American hammer. Infantry moved forward under the protection of naval gunfire, pack howitzers, and the unmistakable roar of the F-4U Corsair overhead. Tanks advanced with infantry riding on their decks, flamethrowers sweeping bunkers moments before grenades and rifle teams closed the final distance. This synergy of arms, something Japanese units rarely achieved due to limited radios, constrained logistics, and rigid command structures, made the Marines unpredictable and devastatingly efficient. By late 1944, diaries from Japanese officers openly admitted that Marine tactics had become scientific, methodical, and immune to the tricks of old warfare, forcing them to acknowledge that they were facing not just brave fighters, but a modern, adaptive, and increasingly lethal force whose innovations made every new island assault more precise and more punishing than the last. The psychological edge: what Japanese soldiers believed about the Marines. As the casualty lists grew and the tide of the Pacific shifted irrevocably against Japan, something far less tangible yet equally powerful spread through Japanese units: a deep psychological respect, often bordering on fear, for the Marines' relentless fighting spirit, a reputation built not through propaganda but through the lived experiences of those who survived direct combat with them. Diaries recovered from Saipan and Peleliu describe Marines as men who do not sleep, fighters who return again after being shot, and soldiers who charge even when surrounded, reflections that reveal how battlefield encounters had begun to reshape Japanese perceptions at the most personal level. Many Japanese troops entered the war believing Americans lacked the will to fight hand-to-hand, yet they were stunned to see Marines who closed the distance aggressively, maintained accuracy under stress, and continued advancing even when low on water, ammunition, or rest. Rumours circulated in foxholes that Marines were specially selected for physical toughness, or that they possessed medical systems so efficient that wounded fighters returned to battle within days. An exaggeration, yet rooted in the reality of a highly advanced evacuation and treatment network that Japan simply could not match. Perhaps the most striking shift came in morale reports sent to higher command, which warned that attempts to intimidate Marines through night raids, banzai charges, or psychological tactics were failing, because the Marines fought with a calm, professional ruthlessness that made them seem immune to fear. By late 1944, many Japanese enlisted men quietly admitted that the Marines' combination of discipline, firepower, and unwavering resolve represented an entirely new kind of enemy, one who met the Imperial Army's most sacred ideal of the warrior spirit, and, in many cases, exceeded it, reshaping the emotional landscape of every battle still to come. Kuribayashi's gamble on Iwo Jima. These are not the same Americans we faced before. When Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was appointed to command the defense of Iwo Jima in 1944, he brought with him a distinctive understanding of the enemy, shaped by his time in the United States years earlier and reinforced by the growing stack of reports detailing Marine performance across 1944, the Central Pacific. And he concluded that the traditional Japanese strategy of meeting the invaders at the shoreline would be nothing short of suicide against an opponent as capable as the US Marine Corps. Kuribayashi studied the disasters at Tarawa, Saipan, and Guam, recognizing a consistent pattern. Marines excelled at breaking frontal defenses through overwhelming firepower, adaptable tactics, and terrifying persistence. He famously warned Tokyo that the Americans are not the weaklings our propaganda portrays, and he insisted that facing Marines required an entirely new defensive doctrine built around endurance rather than sacrificial glory. Rejecting the banzai charges that had annihilated units elsewhere, he transformed Iwo Jima into a subterranean fortress, 20,000 men linked by 11 miles of tunnels, hidden artillery positions, reverse-slope defences, and interlocked kill zones designed to bleed Marines slowly over weeks rather than repel them in a single doomed stand. His hope was not victory, which he deemed impossible, but the infliction of such severe Marine casualties that it might delay or complicate the eventual invasion of Japan. Kuribayashi's strategic writings reveal a clear respect for Marine capability. He openly acknowledged their mastery of combined arms, their discipline under fire, and their unbreakable cohesion, and he built his defences as a reluctant tribute to the only foe he believed could overcome his island's labyrinth of stone and flame. When the Marines finally landed in February 1945, they discovered the truth he had long understood. The battle they were about to fight would demand everything they had, because the Japanese commander waiting for them had designed his plans specifically to counter the strengths that had made the Marines so feared across the Pacific. The Hell of Iwo Jima, when respect became a matter of survival. When the Marines stormed the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, they quickly realized that Kuribayashi's strategy had transformed the island into a nightmare unlike anything they had encountered, and for the Japanese defenders watching from beneath the ground, the Marines' response would confirm every hard-earned respect they had developed over 3 years of war. Instead of the immediate counterattacks Marines had come to expect, the Japanese allowed them to land unopposed, then unleashed a perfectly timed ambush of artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire that turned the beach into a cauldron of jagged shrapnel and choking ash. Yet even under this ferocious bombardment, the Marines did what Japanese soldiers had come to dread. They advanced. They crawled, staggered, reorganized, and pushed forward inch by inch, absorbing casualties that would have broken most armies. Japanese observers noted, with a mixture of astonishment and grim admiration, that Marine units continued to fight cohesively even when reduced to a fraction of their original strength, with corporals and sergeants assuming command roles instantly and without hesitation. In the tunnels below, Kuribayashi received reports describing Marines dragging wounded comrades to safety under fire, coordinating tank infantry assaults through terrain so soft it swallowed vehicles whole, and refusing to yield ground even after being struck repeatedly by hidden artillery. Japanese defenders called them demon soldiers, not out of contempt, but because they seemed physically incapable of giving up, returning again and again to clear pillboxes, flame out tunnels, and seize ridges that had already cost hundreds of lives. The raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi, witnessed by both sides, became a symbolic moment that shook the defenders. They realized that despite their intricate tunnel networks, deadly marksmanship, and willingness to die in place, the Marines' relentless willpower was slowly but inevitably crushing their final stronghold. By the time the fighting ended, with nearly 7,000 Marines dead and over 19,000 wounded, Japanese survivors understood that their respect for the Marines was not theoretical or philosophical. It had been earned in the most brutal, intimate combat imaginable, where survival depended on acknowledging the sheer, unstoppable force of the enemy advancing toward them. The final test at Okinawa, why Japanese forces knew the end was coming. When the Marines landed on Okinawa in April 1945, the Japanese High Command already understood that this battle would not be merely another desperate stand. It would be the final, conclusive test of everything they had learned about American warfare. And for many Japanese soldiers entrenched along the Shuri Line, the presence of US Marines signaled that the Empire's fate had effectively been sealed. Okinawa was fought on a scale far greater than previous island battles, involving hundreds of thousands of troops, torrential rain, mud-choked hills, and a deadly labyrinth of ridges and caves. Yet amid the chaos, Japanese defenders again witnessed the traits that had made the Marines so feared. Their uncanny ability to reorganize under fire, to integrate tanks, artillery, naval gunfire, and close air support with surgical precision, and to grind forward relentlessly despite staggering casualties. Morale reports from the Japanese 32nd Army reveal a growing sense of inevitability, noting that Marines attacked fortified positions with a patience and persistence the Japanese had never expected from Americans, often fighting for a single ridge for days, then pushing on to the next with the same unbroken will. The Japanese took grim note of the Marines' medical evacuation system, which whisked the wounded from the front line to hospital ships within minutes, a stark contrast to Japanese units who often watched comrades die unattended in the mud. And when the Marines countered mass kamikaze attacks at sea, defended their perimeter from night infiltration, and continued their advance through monsoon rains that turned the battlefield into a drowning swamp, Japanese commanders recognized that they were witnessing the culmination of an evolution that had begun back on Guadalcanal. By Okinawa's end, with more than 12,000 Americans dead and the island secured after nearly 3 months of brutal combat, the surviving Japanese officers admitted privately what they could not declare publicly. The Marines were not only the most formidable enemy they had ever faced, but the embodiment of an industrial and tactical power Japan could no longer hope to resist, signaling that the war's final chapter was rapidly and inevitably approaching. After the war, what Japanese veterans admitted about fighting the Marines. In the years following Japan's surrender, as former soldiers and officers were interviewed, wrote memoirs, or quietly recounted their wartime experiences to historians, a striking honesty emerged. Many Japanese veterans openly acknowledged that the Marines had been the most formidable enemy they had encountered, not simply because of superior equipment or overwhelming numbers, but because of a fighting spirit and tactical sophistication that defied everything they had been taught before the war. Men who had survived Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Iwo Jima described Marines as disciplined, coordinated, and terrifyingly resilient, praising their ability to continue attacking even after suffering losses that would have shattered most units. Some Japanese officers admitted that their own assumptions about American weakness had been rooted in propaganda rather than observation, and that the Marines' refusal to surrender, even when encircled, outnumbered, or wounded, had forced a re-evaluation of what constituted true warrior ethos. Kuribayashi's surviving staff members recalled their commander's warnings that Americans, especially Marines, possessed a cleverness and adaptability that Japanese doctrine had failed to anticipate, while enlisted men spoke with a mixture of respect and melancholy about opponents who fought as if each battle were the last, displaying a kind of grim determination rarely seen in other theatres of the war. These post-war reflections carried no sense of flattery. Instead, they were shaped by the shared suffering of men who had endured some of the most brutal combat in human history, recognizing in their former enemies a mirror of their own resolve. What united nearly all their testimonies was the acknowledgement that the Marines had earned their reputation not through myth, but through the raw, unyielding reality of battle, an acknowledgement that continues to shape how the Pacific War is remembered today. The truth behind the fear. In the end, the truth behind why Japanese troops came to fear and respect US Marines is not found in a single battle or a single moment, but in a relentless pattern that stretched from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the cliffs of Okinawa, a pattern in which every assumption the Japanese held about American weakness was shattered by Marines who fought with a discipline, adaptability, and ferocity that defied expectation. Time and again, Japanese soldiers witnessed an enemy who refused to collapse under pressure, who mastered new tactics with startling speed, who combined individual courage with the full weight of an industrial superpower, and who advanced not because the battlefield favoured them, but because they were prepared to pay the staggering cost of each assault. For Japanese commanders, this realization marked the slow erosion of strategic confidence. For the common soldier, it became a visceral truth learned in the smoke and terror of close combat, and as veterans on both sides reflected in the decades after the war, a kind of mutual recognition emerged, an acknowledgement that in the crucible of the Pacific, the Marines had revealed a warrior spirit equal to any in history, forged not in myth but in the brutal demands of survival. So when we return to that opening question, the one that haunted Japanese commanders from 1942 onward, we understand now that the answer lies in the convergence of will, training, innovation, and sacrifice. The Marines were feared not because they were invincible, but because they refused to be defeated, turning every island into a testament to their resolve. And in that truth, the Pacific War leaves us with a final, sobering lesson. That respect on the battlefield is earned only in the hardest moments, where humanity is tested and history remembers those who stood their ground when everything around them urged retreat.